German POWs were astonished by daily hot coffee in American camps. The captured Germans anticipated shackles, starvation, and degradation. However, as their packed vessels arrived at the American coastline, they encountered a completely unexpected situation. Following intense battles in North Africa and Europe, the detained soldiers had prepared for retaliation from their foes. Whispers circulated that the Americans would handle them like beasts, forced into exhausting labor in quarries or abandoned to famine within fenced enclosures. But upon landing in the U.S., the sight left them amazed. Rather than aggressive sentries shouting commands with weapons poised, they observed structured facilities featuring timber huts, health stations, and even gardens near the entrances. The ocean crossing had been grueling, filled with cramped compartments, nausea from waves, and dread of underwater strikes. Tales spread among the troops that they might not survive the trip to America. Yet after the ships berthed, they were escorted inland in formations, watched but not mistreated. Nearby residents occasionally assembled by train depots, gazing inquisitively at the adversary fighters who had formerly embodied Hitler's forces. To the detainees' shock, there was no crowd aggression or taunts. Agricultural workers, parents with kids, and laborers in work clothes observed calmly, a few even providing snacks or smokes through carriage openings. When reaching installations in Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and numerous other regions, the POWs were enrolled, given fresh outfits labeled with prominent PW symbols, and directed to their accommodations. Every shelter included aligned beds, warming furnaces for cold seasons, and openings for natural illumination. In contrast to the soggy ditches of Tunisia or the icy shelters on the Eastern Front, this felt nearly opulent. Certain captives quipped uneasily that they had accidentally entered a vacation spot. Others stayed wary, sure that this pleasant facade was merely a deceptive ploy prior to stricter actions. The initial evening in the facility was uneasy. Numerous remained alert, attuned to the soft murmur of U.S. wardens on their rounds. No yells, no assaults, no echoes of agony from individuals. The captives struggled to accept it. They recalled narratives from Nazi indoctrination portraying Americans as savage criminals intent on ruin. Yet the facility's tranquility refuted those horrifying accounts. Daybreak arrived with yet another astonishment. Prior to the captives departing their shelters, wardens and culinary staff delivered boiling vessels to the dining area. The atmosphere brimmed with a robust, sharp scent that no German could misidentify. It was genuine coffee, piping hot and dark. Following years of alternatives crafted from toasted nuts or grains, the fragrance itself sufficed to elicit surprise. Some POWs paused, pondering if it was permitted for them. Others hurried ahead, vessels outstretched, scarcely controlling their enthusiasm. That initial flavor remained etched in memory. The warm fluid disseminated heat throughout their forms, dispelling the persistent coolness of early light. Several men commented that they hadn't savored authentic coffee since pre-war times. Others chuckled softly, nodding in incredulity. This wasn't the handling they foresaw. This wasn't the retribution they dreaded. Rather, America welcomed them with a beverage signifying both generosity and plenty. The German captives quickly understood that this wasn't a fluke or unique reception. It was standard. Each dawn, consistently, the dining area provided coffee. The drink emerged as the initial minor custom of their fresh existence in confinement. During those beginning periods, the amazement of receiving hot coffee at sunrise eclipsed their bewilderment over being vanquished warriors on alien terrain. Regardless of what lay ahead, the United States had already defied their grimmest anticipations with something as basic as a boiling mug. For the majority of the seized troops, that opening morning wasn't an isolated occurrence, but the commencement of a remarkable pattern. As sunlight emerged over the spiked barriers and observation posts, the eating halls resonated with the rattle of metallic platters and the constant whisper of coffee dispensers being accessed. The drink wasn't dispensed reluctantly or sparingly. it poured generously, as if the opponent's ease mattered little to the U.S. officials. To individuals originating from a Germany where allocation tickets controlled every morsel and faux powder substituted for coffee, the view of boiling cups filled without restraint was perplexing. The ceremony proceeded with armed forces accuracy. Before attendance checks, captives lined up orderly, many still clad in their provided canvas attire, marked with bold PAL characters. Culinary personnel, at times U.S. troops, at times even peer POWs designated for tasks, submerged scoops into sturdy metal holders and topped cups fully. Beside the coffee, captives got loaves, oatmeal, or eggs based on availability. Nevertheless, it was invariably the beverage that distinguished itself. For Germans who had endured years yearning for an authentic caffeine experience, this straightforward everyday provision appeared both wondrous and profoundly paradoxical. The adversaries supplied them with what their native land couldn't. Before long, the facility inhabitants started forming an unofficial tradition surrounding this dawn ceremony. Captives would swap anecdotes in subdued tones while relishing the acrid heat. Seasoned fighters from the Soviet front likened it to the icy hardship of mobile kitchens where tepid grain concoctions were frequently the finest option. Survivors from African campaigns remembered arid operations where scorching temperatures parched their mouths, but offered no respite, and where actual coffee was almost unattainable. For junior troops, many scarcely 2 decades old, it marked the initial occasion. In years they had experienced the beverage their guardians once relished at household gatherings before conflict engulfed all. Americans recognized the significance of coffee for spirit. Their own forces abroad possessed complete supply networks dedicated to guaranteeing beans and powders arrived at combat zones. The U.S. Military Supply Division deemed coffee essential, not extravagant, and applied that reasoning even to the detainees in its custody. Per the Geneva Agreements, prisoners deserved sufficient sustenance, but America exceeded that, employing the drink as an indicator of refinement and regulation. By offering coffee routinely, the wardens not only strengthened habits, but also conveyed a subtle message. The captives would receive treatment under a framework of structure, not brutality. The mental influence was significant. Certain captives subsequently confessed that they started regarding their jailers with hesitant admiration. If the Americans chose to provide such amenities to their adversaries, what did that indicate about the prosperity and steadiness of their country? Discussions started circulating in the shelters. Individuals theorized about U.S. ranches, plants, and transport routes capable of delivering such volumes of beans amid conflict. A handful even pondered vocally if this plenty demonstrated that their homeland's indoctrination, depicting America as corrupt and feeble, rested on falsehoods. The everyday coffee turned into a timer, a reliability in an environment where durations otherwise merged. Periods of detention extended indefinitely. But the ceremony offered a reference that grounded them. At a break, they would detect the infusion and recognize another day commenced. It evolved beyond nutrition. It represented reliability amid war's unpredictability. And for numerous Germans, that steadiness was nearly as startling as the beverage's essence. Amid the Germans, the societal jolt of authentic coffee transcended flavor. In their country, by the conflict's midpoint, coffee had essentially vanished from everyday existence. Shipments of beans from South America and Africa had crumbled under the Allied embargo. Instead, German families prepared imitation coffee, a mixture from baked grains, roots, or nuts. Harsh and dull, it delivered no energy surge, merely the pretense of a warm beverage. For many troops, this substitute blend was all they had encountered since the early 1940s. Now facing boiling cups of true Arabica in a U.S. facility, they sensed as if they had entered a different realm. The disparity wasn't solely gastronomic, but profoundly emblematic. In Germany, coffee's lack mirrored shortage, forfeiture, and the escalating hold of war on ordinary life. In America, even war prisoners obtained it daily. At facility benches, individuals shook their heads in skepticism. Some whispered that only a community with vast assets could squander such an extravagance on its foes. Others chuckled at the paradox that they, formerly esteemed warriors of the Reich, needed to yield before sampling what their kin at home could only imagine. The variances stretched into facility conduct. Germans customarily viewed coffee as a communal beverage linked to assemblies, patisseries, and weekend afternoons. In the facilities, this custom re-emerged. Clusters assembled around metal vessels where individuals shared humor, disseminated rumors, or engaged in games. Dialogues frequently shifted to recollections of pre-conflict Germany. Matriarchs preparing coffee in ceramic containers, patriarchs perusing dailies at the dining surface. The beverage evoked longing, connecting their present attention to a faded, ordinary existence. However, for some, the astonishment bore somber implications. Correspondence seized by reviewers showed that specific captives wavered in portraying the plenty they faced, apprehensive of how their relatives enduring allocation queues and aerial assaults would respond. Nonetheless, others alluded to the difference. One ex-POW later remembered composing that, "The Americans provide us authentic coffee each dawn, while you back home can't locate sweetener for weeks." The comment was partly remorseful, partly rebellious, but it encapsulated the bizarre reversal of wartime predictions. U.S. wardens observed these responses with a blend of entertainment and interest. To them, coffee was so commonplace, so embedded in routine existence, that they barely deemed it noteworthy. Service members abroad got powdered coffee allotments in their supplies, and non-combatants consumed it with morning meals. To witness captives wonder at something so fundamental merely affirmed the gulf between the two cultures. Some wardens jested that coffee served as their covert armament, more neutralizing than armaments or barriers. Gradually, the beverage turned into an unofficial societal swap. Inquisitive captives inquired about U.S. customs, discovering that American laborers drank it at plant signals, administrative staff sipped it from insulated flasks, and troops vowed they couldn't advance without it. Conversely, the Germans recounted stories of their surrogates, chortling ruefully about charred nut blends and scorched grain trials. What originated as surprise developed into a sort of shared acknowledgement. The basic act of consuming coffee unveiled the routine pulse of a community in conflict. By the conclusion of their initial months in detention, the Germans had begun perceiving coffee not merely as a beverage, but as a glimpse into American plenty and societal character. For them, every container was evidence that existence in the United States adhered to patterns unaffected by deficits and blockade, a striking opposition to the privation that characterized their native land. Underlying the apparently seamless provision of boiling vessels was one of the most impressive supply frameworks of the conflict. For the United States, coffee wasn't a treat, but a requirement, positioned alongside grains and nicotine insignificance for spirit. Even prior to America's involvement in the strife, the administration had arranged commerce pacts with Brazil and Colombia, securing continuous deliveries of beans over the ocean. Escorted fleets by maritime crafts maintained the distribution channels active, and storage facilities on the eastern seaboard housed heaps of bags prepared for toasting, milling, and allocation. In armed forces contexts, coffee was integrated into the core of activities. The supply division orchestrated provisions with precise care, assigning quantities of beans per service member monthly, then extending the identical approach to adversary detainees. The Geneva Agreement assured proper nourishment, but the U.S. version advanced further. Detainees would obtain sustenance akin to that supplied to service members at domestic bases. This implied that even within enclosures, German troops arose to the same energizing commencement as the personnel overseeing them. The International Red Cross contributed as well. Though the U.S. possessed the setup to nourish its detainees, global inspectors examined facilities and recorded the consistent supply of coffee as an emblem of compassionate handling. Documents submitted in Geneva juxtaposed U.S. methods with those of other countries, where POWs frequently subsisted on diluted broth or outdated loaves. These findings bolstered America's standing, illustrating that it could maintain norms even when managing opponents. The societal importance of coffee in America rendered its omission inconceivable. Amid conflict, promotions encouraged non-combatants to aid the forces by curbing excess and acquiring beans in controlled amounts. Billboards proclaimed, "Coffee secures victories," associating the beverage with vigilance on production lines and endurance on combat fields. Troops in Europe corresponded home requesting aid bundles with additional containers of milled coffee. That fervor permeated the facilities where supplying it to detainees became nearly instinctive, component of the same countrywide fixation. The immense extent of provision captivated the detainees themselves. In expansive facilities like Camp Swift in Texas or Camp Atterbury in Indiana, multitudes of individuals were catered concurrently. Enormous dispensers able to contain multiple dozens of gallons aligned the eating halls. The operations necessitated regular rail shipments of beans from seaside harbors to the U.S. interior, where processing factories operated continuously. For the Germans, who had witnessed their country falter in supplying even staples in devastated urban areas, the plenty appeared unattainable. Sporadically, deficits in other areas of the U.S. military underscored precisely how steadfastly coffee was emphasized. Occasionally, when allocations of sweetener or protein constricted, the stream of beans persisted largely uninterrupted. This persistence confounded German detainees who anticipated at least intermittent disruptions. Instead, they were compelled to acknowledge that America's worldwide scope, its commercial armada, its entry to Latin American markets, and its manufacturing capability sustained the beverage's flow without interruption. For many, the perpetual supply epitomized more than benevolence. It disclosed the apparatus of a country unscarred by occupation. A community able to exert influence across seas and still allocate space to bestow amenities on its detainees. Each container conveyed not merely stimulation, but a cue of America's potency, coordination, and resolve to preserve regularity even during absolute conflict. As weeks evolved into months, the availability of coffee integrated into the core tempo of everyday existence within the facilities. The dawn repast no longer astounded the detainees. It stabilized them. Attendance verifications, labor designations, and reviews all appeared to revolve around that opening boiling container. Wardens would rouse the shelters at first light, and shortly, the tinkling of metal vessels resounded through the dining space. The beverage wasn't simply an extra. It indicated the initiation of the day's organized timetable. Past morning meals, coffee secured its role in additional segments of the facility pattern. When labor teams proceeded to nearby ranches, lumber mills, or highway groups under agreement with the U.S. administration, their provisions frequently encompassed a flask brimming with warm coffee made that dawn. Ranchers who oversaw these labor units observed with mirth how avidly the Germans consumed it during intervals, even amid oppressive summer warmth. The practice of ingesting coffee at each intermission appeared peculiar to some residents, but for the detainees, it had already transformed into an essential element of detention. The beverage also linked to facility recreation. Numerous facilities set up reading rooms, performance areas, and even inner publications produced by the detainees themselves. Opinion pieces in these duplicated pages regularly referenced coffee casually, whether in grievances about sweetener shortages or in quips about Americans utilizing caffeine as a tool. Facility musical groups and singing ensembles practiced following evening meals, and individuals would frequently congregate beforehand with containers in grasp, regarding the beverage almost as an entry pass to communal activities. In certain facilities, coffee emerged as a means of exchange. A detainee laboring in the culinary area might add an additional scoop to a companion's container for services, cleaning assistance, a crafted game board, or an illustration. The worth ascribed to those additional gulps disclosed just how pivotal the ceremony had become. Tobacco and aid parcels were valued items, but coffee placed almost equally, not due to rarity, but because it bore the assurance of reliability. Health officials, both U.S. and German, even documented its influence on spirit and well-being. Documents indicated that detainees appeared less sluggish and more compliant during dawn attendance after coffee allocation. For individuals habituated to the draining rhythm of frontline clashes and then the tedium of enclosure, stimulation offered a mental enhancement. It prompted them they remained people with patterns, not simply identifiers behind barriers. For the wardens, the beverage served practical purposes too. Dispensing it soothed moods, diminished early agitation, and provided detainees a minor yet potent incentive not to oppose the day's agenda. The gesture of passing containers at first light was as much an instrument of facility oversight as it was an act of courtesy. Unknowingly, both jailer and detainee depended on the identical ceremony, softening, if only marginally, the boundary between foe and provider. By the conflict's midpoint, the coffee queue had turned into one of the scarce elements detainees could rely on amid the ambiguity of war's resolution. Long past the extinguishing of illumination and the quieting of shelters, individuals murmured to one another about the forthcoming dawn, soothed by the awareness that no matter what transpired, the day would start with a known boiling container. For numerous detainees, the coffee ceremony evolved beyond a facility pattern. It transformed into a recollection they inscribed onto paper. Correspondence dispatched home, though meticulously reviewed, frequently included indirect mentions of the beverage. Some individuals depicted their dawns with expressions like, "We commence the day akin to at residence," or "Our morning meal includes its amenities." While direct specifics about sustenance were often excised by U.S. reviewers to prevent inciting bitterness in Germany, the correspondence's manner suggested the amazement the individuals experienced. Kin back home queuing extensively for apportioned spreads, or thinned dairy, would hardly have trusted that their offspring consumed authentic coffee each first light in the territory of the adversary. Accounts gathered post-conflict disclose how profoundly this basic practice embedded itself in recollection. Ex-detainees questioned years later in Germany still narrated with clear detail about the initial swallow each dawn. For some, it wasn't the shelters, the labor assignments, or even the surveillance structures they recalled most vividly, but the ascending scent of beans on the chilly breeze at daybreak. One previous detainee confessed that whenever he detected coffee in subsequent years, he was immediately returned to a facility in Texas, perceiving the clanging of metallic vessels and the scraping of footwear on timber surfaces. Autobiographies also document how detainees linked coffee with an uncommon sense of honor. They remained adversary troops, divested of armaments and attire, but receiving the identical warm beverage as their jailers slightly obscured that distinction. It bestowed upon them a sensation of being regarded as individuals, not simply overcome foes. Such perceptions infiltrated their subsequent remembrances, forming a story that U.S. detention, while limiting, was not degrading. Facility journals maintained covertly despite hazards, affirm these encounters. In one preserved ledger from a facility in Arkansas, a youthful troop outlined daily timetables, denoting each dawn with a tiny vessel icon. His side annotations describe how he anticipated those brief moments more than any other in the day. Another journal record equated the beverage to a cordial greeting from the novel realm. Although these compositions stayed concealed until post-release, they illustrate precisely how central coffee became in the emotional terrain of detention. Researchers examining these accounts have observed that the recollection of coffee frequently eclipsed tougher facets of facility existence. Detainees still tolerated monotony, compulsory work, and the perpetual queue of loss. But when queried about their most notable impressions, many reverted to the identical motif: the routine provision of authentic coffee. The reality that such a trivial element dominated so prominently discloses its representational strength. In Germany following the conflict, When ex-POWs assembled at gatherings, tales of facility life were shared over vessels of coffee anew, solely now in liberty. Veterans chortled about how they had once deemed their jailers' liberality inconceivable. Some even asserted that the custom of consuming coffee first in the morning, which proliferated broadly in post-conflict German homes, originated in those facilities where they had initially rediscovered the flavor. Hence, the beverage exceeded sustenance. It evolved into a recollection that connected their wartime detention with their peacetime existences, tying the history to the now in every swallow. The exact plenty that astounded the German detainees also bore a nuance of discomfort when they started contrasting their circumstances to those of others. By the war's intermediate phases, information seeped into the facilities via periodicals permitted by the Americans, or correspondence from kin, that their own relatives in Germany existed under rigorous apportioning. Aerial strikes had obliterated storage and transport routes, and non-combatants frequently lined up for extended periods to obtain meager shares of loaves or root broth. The notion that individuals in confinement across the sea drank warm coffee routinely while their spouses and offspring battled to secure cleanser or tubers generated a quiet discord. Some detainees grappled with remorse. In correspondence densely encoded to avoid reviewers, a few suggested their disquiet. "We are not overlooked here. In certain respects, we are more fortunate than you at residence." Such phrases, though ambiguous, held immense significance. Troops who had once thought they battled for a supreme Reich now discovered themselves sustained and soothed by their adversaries, while their kin endured the difficulties of a failing war economy. The parallels also reached the combat zone. Updates arrived to the detainees regarding situations for German forces still engaging in Europe, where provisions diminished and distribution paths faltered under unyielding Allied aerial attacks. Descriptions of troops dividing sparse soups in chilled ditches rendered the dawn coffee in America seem dreamlike. Oni ex-POW subsequently commented that the inequality prompted him to doubt not only German command, but also the fundamental aim of the conflict. How could the Reich vow triumph when its troops and non-combatants similarly lacked essentials that even detainees acquired abroad? U.S. spectators recognized these oppositions and occasionally accentuated them in indoctrination. Pieces in American dailies stated that German detainees in the U.S. were managed per global regulations, relishing equitable sustenance and compassionate environments. These accounts contrasted markedly with narratives of U.S. detainees in German custody, many of whom endured on diluted broth or loaves mixed with wood particles. Kin of U.S. POWs perusing about adversary troops receiving coffee and complete repasts sometimes voiced bitterness. Yet, the U.S. administration insisted that maintaining elevated norms mirrored national principles and safeguarded their own personnel overseas. Among the detainees themselves, this contradiction ignited perpetual discussions. Some contended that America's liberality was a deliberate action intended to influence them ideologically, while others thought it unveiled true potency, a capacity to stay compassionate even in absolute conflict. Junior troops, less bound to Nazi doctrine, frequently adopted the latter perspective. For them, the coffee wasn't merely nutrition, but proof that America's community functioned on tenets vastly distinct from the dictatorial strictness of the Reich. Bitterness sporadically emerged inside the facilities as well, particularly when aid visitors recalled the detainees that their handling was overseen and broadcasted. A few individuals grumbled that being tended to so adequately while their colleagues suffered on the front was nearly shameful. Others, though, adopted a practical stance. Endurance in detention with honor was better than demise on a battlefield already shifting against Germany. The coffee thereby became a lens through which the war's inconsistencies were reflected. It was concurrently an origin of solace, remorse, and insight. To consume it each dawn was to sample both the benevolence of the jailer and the shortcomings of the homeland. That strain persisted in the thoughts of many intensifying the effect of detention well past the barriers of the facilities. When the conflict concluded and the detainees were progressively returned home, many bore with them recollections that would form how they discussed America for their remaining years. Amid these remembrances, the dawn coffee emerged as one of the most lasting. What could have appeared as a small particular became for multitudes of individuals an emblem of how diversely their jailers had managed them compared to the vicious portrayals created by wartime indoctrination. Questionings performed in the 1950s and 1960s with ex-POWs disclose how often the topic reappeared. Individuals who had advanced to professions as educators, merchants, or plant laborers still recalled the aroma of coffee in the eating space. Some conceded that the encounter mellowed their views toward the United States, rendering them more open to Western ideals amid the Cold War. In communities throughout West Germany, assemblies of previous detainees frequently featured a kettle of potent coffee on the surface, with jests that America instructed us to consume in this manner. The impact even infiltrated post-conflict German buyer traditions. With the Recovery Initiative injecting support into Europe, U.S. coffee labels like Maxwell House and Chase & Sanborn materialized on market racks, occasionally promoted with mottos about liberty and wealth. Ex-POWs were among the initial to acquire them, attracted by a flavor that evoked their detention. For a cohort that had survived deficiency, the reappearance of coffee to routine existence bore sentimental importance. It evolved not merely a beverage, but a cue that hardship was concluded, and that links to the broader globe had been reinstated. Academics analyzing the heritage of POW encounters observed that the U.S. tactic of compassionate handling yielded benefits. Individuals who had once combated fiercely for the Reich frequently became unofficial representatives post-release, narrating to acquaintances and kin about their unexpected encounters in America. The recollection of receiving warm coffee each dawn opposed Nazi illustrations of the United States as a territory of disorder and savagery. Instead, it emphasized structure, plenty, and even a hint of benevolence. This alteration in viewpoint counted in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when West Germany was synchronizing with the Western Alliance. The heritage was also individual. Journals and autobiographies disclosed that many ex-detainees retained the practice of dawn coffee for their lifetimes. It supplied not just bodily invigoration, but a ceremony of constancy that had once upheld them in enclosure. Some even transmitted the custom to their offspring, connecting family morning tables in post-conflict Germany to the dining halls of U.S. facilities. The persistence of that habit demonstrates how detention, although distressing, left imprints that molded routine existences long post-conflict. In the vast panorama of history, conflicts are frequently recalled for engagements, accords, and governmental disruptions. Yet for the individuals who endured detention, minor particulars bore immense significance. The mug of coffee provided reliably signified more than stimulation. It personified the opposition between two communities, the ethical position of one country toward its adversaries, and the unforeseen compassion discovered in an era of worldwide strife. For German detainees, it was evidence that even in loss, honor could be maintained. And for many, that recollection endured longer than the noise of combat or the view of demolished urban centers.